1 second, let it come in.
Huh?
I wash it, no?
I wash it. I'll put it as person to wash. Come in. How many people?
I haven't seen it. I'm just broadcasting up. Let people come in. 1 second.
Come in. Come on. I'm just about to start the webinar. I'm honestly starting a webinar. I can come out in 15 minutes for a minute.
Wow, what's it doing?
And then the people start clicking. Perfect. All right, done.
How's it, everybody? Welcome to our annual golf day. This year, we're going to learn about a different course. But without further ado, let me pass you on to the chairman of the golf day, none other than Jeff Miller.
Thank you, Rabbi. Welcome, everybody. Good afternoon. I'm sure a lot of us now should be walking down the fairways, enjoying a great day outdoors in the winter sun. Some of us driving off on the luscious tee boxes of Kalani Golf Course, putting on the luscious greens, and even some of us having a second shot in the bunker. But that's not what actually allows us to happen. As you're all aware, we are going through tumultuous times. We're experiencing a lot of different things. And playing golf is not what we unfortunately allowed to do today. But second prize or first prize is getting some insights from Tony Leon, who's most well known to you, a lot of you guys, on maybe some course management. Tony has, I won't go through the whole profile. He has been the longest serving leader of the opposition party in parliament. He served as a South African ambassador to Argentina, Uruguay, and Paraguay. Since serving, Tony also serves as executive chairman of Resolve Communications, a South African-based advocacy for reputation management and strategic communications. And Tony, also to his name, has authored 4 critically acclaimed books. We look forward to hearing what Tony's got to say. So over to you, Tony.
Thanks very much, Jeff. Rabbi David Macinta, more materially his son Aaron, who's actually the technical smart guy in the family, so for bringing us together, and all of you ladies and gentlemen out there somewhere. I was thinking about the fact that this is the anniversary of what would have been the Miracle Drive Golf Challenge today, and would have happened, as Jeff said, but for being on level 3 of our lockdown. And I guess in some ways we're now beyond our mulligan. I speak as an enthusiast. Golf always has to ask for a mulligan, which is this one. And I guess in some ways the world has now used up its mulligan, and we're now confronting something that is very real and very unfathomable. Anyway, we've all used this lockdown for different purposes. One of the books I read, this will get you to level 1, it's so long, is by a chap called Norman Lebrecht. It's called Genius and Anxiety, How Jews Changed the World, 1847 to 1947. It's a rather eccentric and extraordinary book and very interesting. But he starts right at the beginning on page 1 with what he calls folk wisdom about 5 Jews who wrote the rules of society. Moses said that the law is everything. Jesus said that love is everything. Marx said that money is everything. Freud said that sex is everything. And Einstein said everything is relative. And, you know, on the first one, Moses, my father, Ray, who died at a great age of 93 2 years ago in Durban, was for many years a Supreme Court judge, and but was not a particularly religious Jew. But he had one saying from Hillel, which was his favorite, which we actually put on the tombstone. And it is, of course, that very well-known aphorism, love thy neighbor as thyself. That is the whole of Torah, the rest is commentary. And I was thinking about that in finding some formula of words in these dark times, because talking about light unto the nations, I think one of the brightest lights in our particular environment is, of course, Rabbi David Masinta and the Miracle Drive. And it's interesting that the Miracle Drive, which apparently today is the biggest charity event in the whole of our Southern Hemisphere, really started with his initiative, the support of John Newberry of Nissen, which ironically was my father's second name in Hebrew, and of course led to the sort of events that we are familiar with. And about 5 years ago, I had the opportunity of being present with you in Sandton when I spoke to 1,800 people at the Miracle Drive banquet after the golf day. And as my late mother used to say, everything changes in a moment. You're going along, you have these plans, and then suddenly they are disrupted. And I guess what fills us with so much anxiety right now, where we are in the world, here, there, and everywhere, is that for this pandemic, there is at present no cure, no vaccine, and no effective treatment. But, you know, before you get into a pit of despair, there are some very, very powerful antidotes. And those of you who are very familiar with the work of Chabad and the Miracle Drive will know from its website and from daily experience that one of the initiatives which Rabbi Masinta and the organization has spearheaded is ARC. Wonderful acronym ARC. Acts of Random Kindness. And, you know, if you go onto Amazon or Kindle and you want to see what a book most people are reading about now, sort of dystopian fiction corner, you'll find that one of the top sellers in these times of this pandemic upon us is actually very appropriately called The Plague by the famous French writer Albert Camus. And of course, he wrote that book in 1941, and it was about an imagined plague which had affected a country. And at the height of that plague, when 500 people a week were dying, one of the enemies, if you like, in terms of Camus' thinking, was a Catholic priest called Panaloo, because he gave a sermon in the city where the plague was at its height in the cathedral in the main square. And he sought to explain the plague as God's punishment for depravity. But the hero of the book, Dr. Ryu, had a completely different approach. He said the plague is not punishment for anything deserved. That would be to imagine that plagues act in a moral or immoral way, or they have some sort of design. But as the same hero, Dr. Ryu, watches a young innocent child die in his hospital, he knows better. Suffering, as we've seen in recent times, is entirely randomly distributed. It makes no sense. It's not an ethical force, and it's simply absurd. And that is the kindest thing one can say about it. But the doctor, the hero who works tirelessly, as so many of our frontline workers are working tirelessly in our hospitals right now, as I speak to you from the comfort of my home in Cape Town, the doctor tries to lessen the suffering of those around him. He's not a saint, but he makes the central point of Camus' approach. He said, this thing is not about heroism. It is about decency. It may seem a ridiculous idea, but the only way to fight the plague is with decency. Then one of the characters in the book asks Dr. Ryu what decency is. The doctor's response is clipped, but very eloquent. In general, I can't say, but in my case, I know that it consists of doing my job. If you look at the background, the logo behind where Rabbi Masinta is sitting at the Chabad house, there's a very big sign emblazoned behind him, and it says, be kind, be decent. And that to me is what this is about. Decency, kindness. Those are the initiatives that really have seen us through. Now, I was reminded just this very morning, we had a very interesting event, as Robbie said, about the judgment, proving that our courts actually still act independent of the state, and they struck down the regulations as being unconstitutional. Maybe we can have a chat about that at the end. But there was a very interesting letter in the Business Day in Johannesburg this morning. And it was by a chap I actually done a lot of work with called Adam Kraker, who's the CEO of a company called IQ Business. And he reminds the readers that this week in history, 80 years ago, from May the 26th to June the 4th, the situation was unfolding on the beaches of Normandy at Dunkirk. You might have seen the movie a few years ago, very epic film. And that required a response. And the response was something like 336 Allied troops who were stranded on the beaches. I could add, just in brackets or parenthetically, that if they hadn't been evacuated, Britain wouldn't have had an army, which was stranded in France. But the shallow waters stopped the British destroyers from reaching the troops to evacuate them. And so it was thanks to 850 private and small boats, manned by Royal Navy officers and actually volunteers, weekend sailors, who went out from England to France and helped rescue the troops. And he says, Adam Kraker in his letter today, that something very similar is happening in South Africa. You see it all around you. You've got the Chabad Miracle Drive. This community, and I know people who have directly benefited from it and who have contributed to, have started a Geshe fund, which helps businesses that are in distress, tide them over these times, that little boat, or a big boat if you like. We have, at a much bigger level, funded by some of our most philanthropic billionaires in this country, people like the Oppenheimers and the Ruperts and the Enthovens and so on, something called the Solidarity Fund. And so our society, although it is riven by this terrible disease, is actually coming together separately, collectively, individually, communally, to do a whole lot of things. Acts of random and specific kindness. Now, of course, I know that everyone's working on different things and doing their bit at the moment at home or in the office or virtually. So apart from reading big, long books like this one, I've also occupied myself in part by writing a new book, the fifth one. And we haven't quite settled, the publisher and I, what it's going to be called, but at the moment it's called Men of Zeal, which comes from the quotation from the late Justice Louis Brandeis. You might know, incidentally, in the 1920s, he was the first American Jew appointed to the United States Supreme Court. And Brandeis was a very progressive jurist. He had a view on the state and society and individuals. He did believe the state should be empowered to help people, but he didn't believe that the state should be able to take over people's lives. And he said in one of his famous judgments in Olmsted versus the United States, that we should always beware of men of zeal, well-meaning with little understanding, because those are often the people who can take away our liberties, even though they proclaim that they are doing great good. And I think if you interrogate the judgment which was handed down in the Gauteng North Court yesterday, you'll see a modern version of what Justice Brandeis said. But what I've tried to do in this new book, which hasn't yet been concluded, but it's getting there, is to actually look at some of the events, important and unknown, some of the personalities, very well known and some completely obscure, who have led South Africa to the place it finds itself in 2020. And just like Rabbi Masinta and the Chabad organization has had to keep changing things to keep pace with this crisis and pandemic that is upon us, I keep having to rewrite it because the script keeps changing almost as I finished putting the words down on paper or on the computer screen. Now, as you know, and you might have read some of them, dozens of books have appeared on our local shelves, chronicling what has gone right when we started this brave and inspiring new dawn of democracy here in 1994. Even more volumes, and bad news always sells much more than good news, have been published on what's gone wrong. The sort of vertiginous slide downwards from Nelson Mandela and Desmond Tutu's Rainbow Nation to what you might call the Republic of Resentment and Decline. But also as we see with the Miracle Drive, even now, a place where light shines out literally in the dark times engulfing this country. But I suppose without, you don't need a rocket science degree to know this, that neither destination, the utopia of our fondest imaginings or the dystopia of our darkest dreams, was inevitable, or even before their occurrence, often likely. Both of those, the high road or the low road, as Clem Sunter used to call it, those opened to South Africa 25 years ago, were navigated by men and women of zeal. Some were zealous in a good sense, sort of people that you meet who support things like the Miracle Drive, singular in purpose, selfless and committed, and others were greedy, corrupt, and entirely selfish. Yet others who plowed the national path in more recent times were committed to decent ends and pursued irrational and self-defeating means to achieve them. And, obviously, I wrote this book before I saw the judgment that was delivered yesterday, which has knocked these regulations out of the park for the moment. And I think that was the central tenor of the judgment, which I've only looked at the headlines of, and that is that the means cannot be justified by the ends you're trying to achieve. So if you want to say, I'm going to try and slow down the infections or prepare the health service, you cannot use any or extreme means to achieve that end. The means, in fact, have to be proportionate to the ends. And of course, what is often, I think, pulled South Africa down, and we are not an exception here, unfortunately, many countries have seen the same thing, is that too many people are prisoners of dogma, or they are completely blinded by the ideology. Now, faith is a very good thing when it comes to religion, but blind obedience when it comes to politics is a very, very bad thing. You've got to adapt to the circumstances you find yourself in. Now, of course, there's always been in history, not just in South Africa, but in the world, a contest between what you might call the great man theory of history, that it is human beings who drive events rather than big events which determine how our human leaders react. And a few months ago, in November 2019, I was preparing for a public interview with one of the more consequential and certainly one of the more controversial presidents of recent times, F.W. de Klerk. And as I was preparing for it, one of these moments of serendipity, you think, well, what am I going to ask this guy? And suddenly you're reading an article in a magazine and bingo, there you have it. And so I subscribe to this rather obscure magazine, essential reading for diplomats past and present or future, called Foreign Affairs. And in the November issue, just before this dialogue I was having with F.W. de Klerk, there was an article. And it was written by two American scholars, Daniel Byman and Kenneth Pollack. And it was called In Beyond Great Forces, How Individuals Still Shape History. And what they do in this article is to say there's always a tension in international and domestic affairs between individual leaders, both famous and infamous, who drive events, what you might call in fancy terminology, the structuralist zeitgeist, where huge sweeping forces trump the power of personality. But obviously, both of them matter. We're looking at the United States today in great turmoil. It's got a public health crisis, it's got a financial crisis, and it's got a race crisis after the killing of George Floyd in Minnesota a few days ago. But you might say, would the reaction have been entirely the same if Hillary Clinton had beaten Donald Trump and become president of America 3 years ago? Actually, one doesn't know, because the Black Lives Matter, which was the initial response in Black communities to police violence, didn't happen on Trump's watch. It happened on Barack Obama's watch. So a lot of the institutional problems, the injustices, don't change simply because you have a different personality at the top. Now, this is not an endorsement of Donald Trump, who I think has done some rather extraordinarily bad things to take a situation and put petrol on it. but that's another matter. One could also say that Britain, country many of us are familiar with, would have been in a very different situation the same year Trump is elected if David Cameron had not called a referendum on Brexit. Very likely, if he hadn't done that, he could still be Prime Minister and Boris Johnson would be a disaffected backbencher. But what those two authors, Pollock and Byman, wrote about de Klerk, which is more relevant to us, was the following. They said, some might scoff at the argument, contending that vast impersonal forces, the ruthless domestic politics of a country like South Africa roiled by civil war and a regime's inherent desire to survive, make it unimaginable that any leader in such a position would step down. Yet it is worth remembering that South Africa's President F.W. de Klerk did just that. And here you can play the what-if game even more acutely by asking yourself what would have happened in 1989, incidentally the year de Klerk was elected president and I as a backbencher went to Parliament for the first time and the Chabad Miracle Drive was launched by Rabbi Masinta and David Newbury. You might ask, what would have happened if P.W. Botha hadn't had a stroke and he'd continued in office and there'd been no de Klerk as president of South Africa? Or in our own more immediate history, what would have happened if 2 years ago, in December 2017, Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma had got just 80 more votes and become president of the ANC in South Africa? Actually, you might say it doesn't really matter. She seems to be the Prime Minister of South Africa these days, but that's, as they say, an understory. So I guess my view is that human agency, as we know, makes a very decisive difference. And I want to just illustrate that in South Africa's context. Because 4 years ago, I was at a reunion event near the Parliament of South Africa, where I'd served for so many years, and was just on the eve of the 10th of December. And you might recall that 24 years ago now, but it was 20 years ago then, Mandela signed our Constitution into law. And it's a very powerful document. I just want to reach out and get you a copy. It's a very small document, but it actually contains a whole lot of essential rights, as the High Court has ruled again and again and again, and hopefully will keep on ruling. Keeps people in check. But at this function, which was chaired with his customary flair by Dennis Davis, you know, judge for yourself, well-known television and juridical star, I was empaneled with several others who'd all been together in the Constitutional Assembly writing this document way back in 1996. And we discussed how this constitutional compact was achieved and how under stress it certainly was in 2016. Now, one of my colleagues from those times, Corne Mulder, who was and still is a member of Parliament for the Freedom Front, made two very essential points. The first is, he said, and this was the height of the depths of the Zuma administration, he said that only about 6 members of Parliament out of 400, and even fewer today, and maybe 3 cabinet ministers in 2016, were actually present when the Constitution was being written. So they were completely, in a direct sense, unknowing or ignorant of the clashing dramas and the essential compromises which birthed this document. So if you weren't present at the time, you have a very derivative sense of how it happened and why so many key cornerstones, such as the property clause and so on, are very important. But he made another point that day, which goes to the issue of human agency. He said, the Constitution creates offices, instruments, and processes. It is human beings who fill those positions and who use or abuse it. So in other words, the same presidency of South Africa, which was filled with great distinction by Nelson Mandela between 1994 and 1999, with all the powers and all the potentials for abuse, was filled with dishonor by Jacob Zuma between 2009 and 2018. And we must see how the present chap does. It's a bit early, but mixed results so far. So one of our teachers, or my teachers, not spiritual, but legal, at Wits University in 1980, Johan van der Pfeiffer, told our class of constitutional law, he made a very interesting point. He said, if you ever get a chance of writing a constitution, I was one of the people who did, always make sure you write it as though your worst enemy gets into power, not your best friend. And as the former Deputy Chief Justice of South Africa, Dikgang Moseneke, rather, I think, ruefully said, well, we, of course, wrote the Constitution with a Mandela in mind, and then he didn't add, but you landed up with a Zuma. So I cannot stress that while human beings and human agency is very, very significant, it's also hugely important that we do not give them unfettered power. And you know, Thomas Jefferson, one of the great founding fathers, arguably the cleverest, they say, in a very overcrowded field back then, of the United States of America, said if men were angels, no constitution would be necessary. But of course we know men aren't angels, neither are women, and therefore they are. So here we are. We're in June 2020 with this unfathomable crisis upon us. And everyone in the world, strangely enough, for the first time in human history, actually faces the same enemy. I mean, nobody's a friend of coronavirus. Nobody wants coronavirus, unless you're sort of left field Mashugana. And so it's very unusual because every conflict, if you see this as a war, has always been fought between various sides. So here, the whole of humanity is on the one side. It was said we're all in the same boat, but of course, relatively speaking, some have got super yachts and others are sinking in leaking life rafts, both countries and individuals within countries who experience and have the defense mechanisms which differ very widely. And that, incidentally, is why all the interventions made by so many organizations, those little boats like the Chabad Miracle Drive, are so important. Now, you know, just 5 kilometers from where I'm sitting in the southern suburbs of Cape Town, way back in 1966, Robert F. Kennedy gave the Day of Affirmation address at the University of Cape Town. And he said something which so goes into this theme of standing up, being kind, making a difference. Every bit helps, whether you're making peanut butter sandwiches, my wife and I do 2 or 3 times a week to help people who are in need or contribute to Miracle Drive. All of it helps. It all goes into a vast amount of goodwill and kindness. Be kind, remember. And Robert Kennedy said the following at the University of Cape Town, and if you go to Arlington National Cemetery, where he was buried after his assassination 52 years ago, these words appear on his tombstone. He said, few will have the greatness to bend history itself, but each of us can work to change a small portion of events. It is from numberless, diverse acts of courage and belief that human history is shaped. Each time a man stands up for an ideal, or acts to improve the lot of others, or strikes out against injustice, he sends forth a tiny ripple of hope, and crossing each other from millions of different centers of energy and daring, those ripples build a current which can sweep down the mightiest walls of oppression and resistance. Extraordinarily powerful words, very poignant to us here and to the world today as we find ourselves in. Of course, they could be applied in America today, and before any of us suffer from schadenfreude about what's happening there, just remember we had a killing, a brutal, violent killing of Collins Causa in Alexandra a few weeks ago, which was every bit as awful as what happened to George Floyd in Minnesota. Once again, the abuse of power, the misuse of authority, the misapplied lessons of leadership. But of course, another very different politician from either Donald Trump and certainly from Robert Kennedy was the United States Defense Secretary, Donald Rumsfeld, also a center of a lot of controversy. And Rumsfeld famously said before the Iraq war, he said, you go to war with the army you have rather than the army you wished you had. And I was thinking about that because many years back in August 2003, I was in Tel Aviv as invited to attend the 80th birthday party of Shimon Peres. Now, it's worth reflecting that in 2003, Shimon Peres was out of office. He'd been famously failed to become prime minister and in an election against Bibi Netanyahu. And he looked like he had a great future behind him. And heaven knows, at 80 years old, with such a distinguished record of citizenship and service in his state, you would think he'd go into a quiet retirement. And I found it quite extraordinary. I have to say that for those of you who met him or heard him, whatever you think of his politics, because I'm a bit of a fan, but I guess one or two of you aren't, Shimon Peres is undoubtedly the most articulate person I've ever heard in English. And bear in mind, Polish, then Hebrew, and only English was his third language. He also apparently spoke French as well as did English. A sort of polymath and a man of great articulacy. And that evening, in a very splendid function at the Mann Auditorium in Tel Aviv, he made an extraordinary speech. He said, people prefer remembering to imagining. Memory deals with familiar things. Imagination deals with the unknown. Imagination can be frightening. It requires a departure from the familiar. And then he quoted something that David Ben-Gurion said, all are experts on what was. There are no experts on what will be. And this 80-year-old bloke, who thought should perhaps be retired, or was at the time, I think, went on to talk about why he was thinking ahead. He was talking about technology, nanotechnology, extraordinary things, some which I could barely understand. And of course, 3 years after that speech, he was elected president of the state of Israel, and he lived on for another 13 years to die at the age of 94, garlanded with honors there and across the world. And I use Peres as an example, not to talk about his ideology, but to talk about this extraordinary attachment an 80-year-old man has, looking forward, not looking back, to days past. My wife's always criticizing me when I get on the phone to my political buddies. She says, oh, you're always talking about, what happened in Parliament in 1996. Well, talk about the future. So, married to an Israeli, you're going to get some tough lessons, but the lesson actually came from Mr. Peres. So, let me conclude with some thoughts about the future, which is entirely unknowable. I'll leave you with 3 ideas. None of them are original, but I'd like to share them because they come from people I respect greatly. The first is Thomas Friedman, globalization pundit, writing in the New York Times the other day, said actually this century's only been 20 years, it's been very crowded. We've had 4 huge global calamities. Current one, of course, coronavirus. The beginning of the century, we had 9/11. Then we had the global financial crisis, 2008. And what an ongoing, but now has been heightened in the last 2 decades, and with us for a long time, is climate change. And Friedman borrows a very useful phrase. He talks about a black elephant. And you might have heard, of course, of the black swan, which is an unlikely, unexpected event with enormous ramifications, and coronavirus people would probably characterize as a black swan event. But actually he said that 9/11, global financial crisis, and climate change are what he terms black elephant events, because that combines a black swan with the elephant in the room. And what is the elephant in the room? It is a looming disaster that is visible to everyone, yet no one wants to address it. And all these crises actually were seen by people before they came, but not any of them were responded to timelessly. Now, of course, you can't respond to every irritation. I remember when I was a child growing up, and our only form of entertainment was Springbok radio, puts you in a certain vintage, pre-television age, and we had this advert, Stearns, Pine Tar and Honey. You can't take every cough to a doctor. Well, hell, you get a cough now, you probably should head off to a doctor. You never know what might be lurking in your larynx or throat. But the truth is that 9/11, there were those FBI agents in Minnesota who thought something was very strange with the flight schools in Florida, where the Saudi terrorists were being trained. The 2008 global financial crisis led Queen Elizabeth to ask the economists at the Bank of England afterwards, how come none of you chaps saw this coming? Well, of course they did, but 2 people too busy making money to stop the music. And of course, you only have to look at any of those videos, of which Bill Gates is perhaps the most famous, as people who presciently said, we're going to have a global pandemic. And we had one called SARS-1, and this is, of course, SARS-2. So they will keep on coming and keep coming at us with varying degrees of severity unless we start behaving differently. And so this then brings me to two concluding thoughts. Will we behave differently? And here, of course, the views are as wildly diverging as the immunology, the models, and the forecasts are about coronavirus, which incidentally, if you literally took seriously everything you read, you would be running around in circles. So better not, just take a deep breath. There is a view, it was very well presented by Lord Daniel Finkelstein in the Times of London on the 14th of April. And he said we could call it the Kumbaya view, that this might be, this coronavirus and its aftermath, a moment of revelation and unification. Together, we have been given insight into much that is wrong with our world and reviewed and renewed a sense of unity and determination. That will allow us to address these ills. When this is over, we'll create a better world, and we may even become better people in that world. Now, having set up the skittle, as we say in law, he proceeds to knock it down. He says, I hope this view is right, but this is a hope rather than expectation. As with all disease disasters, this one will leave the civilization it has attacked much weaker and much poorer. The need for justice may have arisen, but the means to achieve it will have been diminished. As with all similar setbacks, economic and social, there will be a political battle over resources, which usually manifests itself in sharper antagonisms and less trust. As, states battle coronavirus, and we know this in South Africa, governments have taken on unprecedented powers, and they have done it with the support of people who want protection. But how easy, Finkelstein asks, once the initial danger has passed, will it be to get them to relinquish these powers, especially if they can point to the danger of further infections and more deaths without those powers? So that is, he weighs down on the thing that it's a hope, but actually it's the expectation is we aren't going to have a much better and kinder world, because even if we want one, our resources are going to be very diminished to get towards their achievement. And you have the state, which is getting more and more powers and encroaching on our individual liberties, and it's not going to be easy to get those powers back from the government. Now, a more positive view was offered, strange enough, the very next day on the 15th of April, 2020, in the Financial Times by the Nobel laureate Amartya Sen, under the heading, A Better Society Can Emerge from the Lockdowns. And drawing from the pre-lockdown period, which very much applies in South Africa, he said, look, what was the situation before the coronavirus struck? You had rampant inequality. You had millions who lacked healthcare. You had austerity economics. Well, we haven't had that in South Africa. And anti-democratic populism. Cue Mr. Julius Malema and others in that score. And Sen, in contrast perhaps to what Finkelstein's saying, says the need for people to act together can generate an appreciation for the powerful and constructive role of public action. And he used an example, World War II, talking about a great crisis, where he said far more people realized the importance of international cooperation. The United Nations, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank were all created in 1944 and 1945, just before and just after that global conflict ended. He also points to the case of England, where for the first time, millions of people who had been severely malnourished, it's funny to think of hungry English people, but there were much better fed on a more equal basis during the war, even though there was extreme rationing, than they had been before. And he said that planted the seed of the National Health Service and the welfare state. And he suggests that what we do during this crisis will help prepare us for a positive outcome afterwards. So, between those two views, you probably have a middle way. And I began this talk by mentioning the 5 Jews who wrote the rules of society, of whom Moses was the first, arguably, or not beyond argument, our founding father. Now, I'm certainly not as expert. I have no claims of expertise as Rabbi Masinta does in this field, but I was a rather reluctant attendee at the Cheder in Durban, preparation for my bar mitzvah. And through the distant memory of youth, I do recall that the book of Deuteronomy was, in fact, the collation of Moses' sermons in the land of Moab. And there's something in Deuteronomy which actually, to me, is the most powerful message for these times. And it suggests that we shouldn't be blindly optimistic, but simply being a pessimist offers the empty consolation of perhaps being right, but it's going to be pretty empty one at that. So if I might conclude, since we are with the Chabad, with what is written in Deuteronomy in chapter 30, verse 19, I have put before thee life and death, the blessing and the curse, therefore choose life. And as we say on Friday nights, never has there been a better time to say it, l'chaim. Thank you very much.
Jeff, would you ask the questions here that are coming through?
Mute myself. Thank you, Tony. I have a number of questions that are coming through. One from Howard Phillips, who also appreciates good art. He says, Tony, as ministers in cabinet continue to put their feet in their mouths on an almost daily basis, I'm beginning to lose faith in Cyril. At the end of the day, he's our leader and must take responsibilities for his ministers and their decisions. Why does he allow this to happen? It's making him look pretty pathetic. Your thoughts, please.
I completely agree with the question. You know, it's not because I don't like Cyril. He's very difficult not to like. In fact, I attended an event that Cyril spoke at. I guess quite a few who were there. It was in Joburg just before the year before the election out in Sandton, and he was being asked questions by Stephen Kossoff and the Jewish Board of Deputies, got multiple ovations. There was a huge amount of hope. And I think the reason there was so much hope is because of not so much who he was, but who he wasn't. He wasn't Jacob Zuma, and that was the cause of hope. But you know, beyond that, he was all a bit vague and aspirational and not very specific. And I think we're seeing the limitations of that approach now. You know, I started my talk by reminding you about de Klerk, and I'm not, you know, de Klerk was a pretty extremely conservative person, and he was a pillar of the apartheid system until he changed. But he, in his first speech in Parliament on the 2nd of February 1990, he basically turned his back on 46 years of National Party dogma and changed direction. And I don't want to overstate that, but he looked straight past his internal opponents, and he looked past his external opponents in the Conservative Party who were breathing down his neck more than my party was, and he took the decisions that we live with today. Now that required, you know, you might say he did it because he had no option, but that required a lot of courage, and it required a determination. And I haven't seen that courage or determination from Ramaphosa, except it is possible that a lot of the more extreme stuff coming from the mouths of Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, or indeed Ibrahim Patel, who's both a micromanager and a communist, have the support of Cyril Ramaphosa. And that might suggest to you that those who thought, well, you know, the president actually is a business-hugging lover of the free enterprise system might be mistaken. And I think that Cyril has a very chameleonic curriculum vitae, you know, one stage a communist, then a trade unionist, then a big business guy through BE and so on. And you know, it's a bit like you take the bits from it that appeal to you and you ignore the inconvenient bits. So the real Cyril is unknown to us. Look, he's very articulate, he's very reassuring. I described him after one of his appearances as like a GP, you know, with a bad diagnosis, but he makes you feel better when he's giving it to you. So you feel somewhat reassured when you hear him speak. And, you know, unlike JZ, he can read out a set of numbers with great aplomb. But absolutely, just to go back to the question, he has to take responsibility for his ministers, and by them he shall be judged. He appointed them, and we saw on this ridiculous U-turn over the cigarette saga, which is far from over, that he allowed, you know, Nkosazana Zuma to basically emasculate him, and then tamely went along and said, well, it was a collective decision. Now, when a president which I've been researching as part of this book I was boring on about a minute ago, has the sort of powers that Cyril Ramaphosa has, or any president of South Africa, which actually make Donald Trump's powers in America seem very modest, domestically at least. Our president's got huge powers in South Africa. When he can only tamely say, well, I'm part of a collective, that is not leadership, that's the abdication of leadership.
Thank you. I have another question here. When you were an ambassador, did you not find it frustrating when you had to try and encourage countries and businesses to invest in South Africa, having to battle the regulations, red tape, and lack of commercial sense of the government?
Well, yes and no. I have to say I was there between 2009 and 2012 in a country that was even more business unfriendly than South Africa, Argentina, which is the largest Spanish-speaking economy in South America. And I mean, made our crowd seem, like libertarian free marketeers. So to quote the great Einstein, as I said at the beginning, everything is relative. But of course, in those days, we had a much easier product to sell because there was none of these mad tourism rules. We had direct flights between South America and South Africa. And on the economic front, we had entrenched property rights. They weren't up for grabs. Bear in mind, this only happened when the ANC got going in 2017 at their conference. So I could stay, and we brought a lot of investment in from South America to South Africa to a big agri processing company, one of the biggest, who came to buy our ranch lands in Eastern Cape. I said, your property rights are quite secure in South Africa because we have Section 25 of our Constitution. Now, whoever my successor is today cannot give that assurance because the property rights in our Constitution are now like an auction up for grabs to the highest bidder or the loudest bidder. So I think it's certainly declined, the investment. And we also had an investment protection treaty, for example, Jeff. We had one between Argentina and South Africa. There were 10 at that stage, bilateral investment treaty protection orders between the United South Africa and the European Union, and they've systematically been thrown out. So, yeah, there has been a deterioration in the investor environment for foreign investors in South Africa, and it's deteriorated very sharply since 2015.
Your current views on the DA and the future after their dismal performance in last elections?
Well, look, dismal is a relative concept. They did decline. They lost 500,000 votes. It's a very bad thing, but they still, got 20% of the vote, and by far the largest opposition party, twice as large as the next one. And you'd rather hope it stays like that since the next party is the EFF. That was a very bad moment for the party. When I led it for 13 years and then Helen Ziller after me, we'd always improved, often dramatically, on the previous election. This is the first time in DA history since the party was founded in 2000 that the party had gone backwards. Now, to his credit, Musi Maimane responded by appointing a commission of 3 people, and I was one of the 3. And then when we made a finding that said some adverse things about his leadership, he left, which perhaps was not the smart thing to do, but that's history. So I think the DA realized it had a problem and has got one and is starting to address it. And it takes time. I led that party when it had only 7 MPs. I left it at 57 MPs. It now has about 84 MPs. So, there's a solid infrastructure. They govern the Western Cape. They've got quite a few city councils, but they've made mistakes. And the thing about mistakes is to learn from them, not to repeat them. And it's early days, but I think with John Steenhuisen as the interim leader and some other smart people in the party who principled, people have a better idea of what the DA stands for because, when I looked, because we had 40 people we spoke to this commission and we looked at 230 submissions. If I might use a word from the vernacular, the view about the DA, apart from some leadership issues, was it was parev. It was neither one thing nor the other. It was very milk toast, if you like. Sorry, it's a stretched analogy. It was a bit ANC light, a bit ANC bashing. I think any political party needs to have sharp angles. It needs to leave its supporters not in a state of bewildered confusion about what it is. And increasingly, I think the DA is starting to say the things that a party like the DA should say. Whether it's going to recapture lost ground, well, that'll be proven in the next election. I hope so, because as I said in another webinar when I was a lot of folk overseas last week, I said, you know, you can't live in a democracy unless you have a strong opposition. And a weak opposition is simply an invitation to one-party tyranny. And we've had too much one-party domination in South Africa. So we need a bit of an alternative that grows, not declines.
Okay, thank you. I've got a final question. Gives a little bit different view. Is what is your advice on talking publicly as a politician while adhering to the concept of lashon hora?
I'm not. It's a brilliant question, actually. Yes, well, you know, the evil tongue. I'll tell you something, and it was politically very smart. Bill Clinton said something to this effect. He said it's a very complicated thing. He said, if you survey people and you ask them, they say they don't like negative campaign tactics. Lashon hora, you might say, you know, talking ill of your opponent. But he said why it's a strange and complicated thing is people reward such tactics with their votes. In other words, people will say, we don't like to see negativity. We don't like to see character assassinations. But when it comes to voting, people often reward that. I mean, you know, with great respect or the lack of it to Donald J. Trump, I mean, he specializes in this. And it's quite effective, if you like, because you remember his demonization of people. He calls Biden Sleepy Joe. He called Jeb Bush low energy. I mean, these are things that stick. He's like a playground bully, and he picks on a weakness of his opponent, and you remember that. And maybe you reward it with a vote. You know, you'll be a bit of a scam stem fear for Trump, but maybe just go and vote for him because he stands for something and these others are too weak. So, look, I think there is, and I was pretty robust when I was a political leader, but I do think you can take people on without destroying their characters. I think that is a useful thing. I think it's much better to attack an argument rather than a person. But I guess you also, you know, let's look at the situation in South Africa. You know, the person who did a lot of damage to this country, according to Cyril Ramaphosa, he took 1 trillion facilitated stealing, was Jacob Zuma. Now, it was very difficult to attack the system of state capture without attacking him as an individual, because after all, as I said, Mandela held the same office and he didn't abuse it, and Zuma did and desecrated it. So it's quite difficult sometimes to decouple that. But there are always limits, and I think we should be respectful of those, but not so easy often to delineate them.
Okay, thanks, Tony. I don't have any other questions, so I think without further ado, I'm going to just hand over to Robbie Siegel to make some closing remarks.
Sure. Thank you.
Robbie. You're on mute, Rob. Robbie, you're on mute.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Now we can.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Tony, thank you. Thank you very much for giving up your time to be with us today. I think it's a great pity that you're not back in Parliament sort of representing us, because I think the way you speak and the way you come across is really admirable. It's been an absolute privilege and a pleasure to listen to you. I want to thank you for giving up your time. I also want to thank Rabbi Masinta, because I think, you know, if people can look at the sign that's behind his desks, be kind. I think a lot of people have actually done that in this time. Rabbi, you've been a huge influence on all our lives. I think I've never seen a guy with energy like yours. You're always available for people. It's been a pleasure and a privilege for me to have helped you with your golf day. And it's such a pity that I just want to change one thing that Jeff said. He mentioned the Kalani golf course. It was actually the Houghton golf course, the beautiful Houghton golf course with the fairways. And I think, Rabbi, if today's anything to go by, we look forward to many, many more golf days with you, raising a lot of money for your organization, for the Chabad. And for me personally, it's been a privilege to be involved with you in many other things as well. I mean, I'm a huge admirer of Miracle Drive and what you do for people. And I think what's come out of today is that we've just got to do more for each other. We've got to watch each other's backs. There are going to be huge opportunities coming out of this crisis. And we've got to go into these things positively, not negatively. And I think everybody's got to share that. It's no good sitting back and saying, well, because the next guy's in trouble, then, you know, it's okay that we're in the same boat. We've got to go in with the right mindsets. We've got to help each other. We've got to do what's right. And I really believe that this whole thing will play out. There will come a time where we'll be back doing the things that we love doing. So again, Tony, thank you for your time. And we wish you well on your endeavors and good luck with the book. I look forward to buying it.
Thank you.
All the best. Thank you.
Thanks, eh?
Thank you. Thank you, Rabbi.
Yeah.
Thanks, Jeff.
Thanks, Rabbi.
Thank you all for your
All
attendance. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
Cheers.
Cheers, guys.